Happy February, everyone. Today we're going to be doing block number 2 of our Bernina Quilt Along block of the month. And this is going to be block number 2, so get a visual here. And I'm going to take a picture of this and put it in the description in the group. I can't post a video on YouTube or a photo on YouTube. I don't know how. But I will put a picture of this block in the description and information for this month's block in the Bernina group on Facebook. And so here we have block number 1 and block number 2. And a couple reminders before we get started. Don't use steam in your iron. Cut carefully, stitch carefully, make sure you test your 1/4 inch seam. And nest seams wherever possible. And on this block, if you're having trouble nesting seams, I would just suggest you press your seams open. But you don't have to do that. You can see that I didn't. And we have a space here for some embroidery if we decide we want to put something in there. So let's get started cutting this pretty block out and getting it stitched up. So for our block 2, we're going to need 4 pieces of fabric. I have 2 here of the same one, but I haven't unfolded them yet to see how much I have. So you just need 4 pieces of fabric. You need some contrast. This is going to be my background in this block, and I got my first block out to kind of see. I'm not going to do the, I think for the picture that I showed you, there's like a couple strips put together here and then a little checkerboard, maybe it's down here, a little checkerboard. I'm not going to do that. I am just going to put 2 or maybe 2.5 inch wide sashing around all my blocks. They are still going to be set on point, but they're not going to have the that border that's in the picture. I'm just going to do something simple because I'm using scraps. So I'm hoping I can find something in my stash, which isn't very much, that I can use for these sashings around each block, and then maybe put a wide border around the whole quilt when I'm done. But anyway, that's what I'm going to do. So just like in block number 1, we're going to take these over and we are going to put Best Press or spray starch or Terrio Magic sizing, whatever you use to get these starched really, really well. We're just going to starch the heck out of these things, and then we'll start cutting things out. So here's my background fabric, and I've pressed with Best Press, Terrio Magic I used, and a little bit of water, misted over it, and I've pressed it from about here over, and I am gonna square up this side. Whoops. And out of the background fabric, we need, and you can print this off, I've put this with the video, and from the background fabric we need 6 3 7/8 by 3 7/8 inch squares. So I know I can fold this over. Now that I have it squared up, I can fold this over and see if I can find 4 inches is pretty close. 7/8 is too close to 4 inches to me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's 5 inches. So I'll fold it over 5 inches down the way. And I'll cut out my 3 7/8 inch squares 2 at a time. So I'm going to cut a 4.5 inch block out of this, and then I'm going to cut it down to 3 7/8 because I have my fold on one side and a selvage that I have to deal with. So I'm just going to cut out 3 because I need 6 blocks. So I'm going to cut out 3 4.5 inch squares, and then I'll cut my real blocks out of those. And I've got plenty of room. So, good deal. There we go. And there's my backgrounds. So I'll cut these out at 3 7/8 now. And I will put this fabric away for another project. I've got plenty left for something else. And we'll move on to cutting out our contrast pieces. Measure twice. Say it with me. Measure twice. Cut once. This edge isn't very nice. This makes me very happy, so I'm going to square it up. So it's always nice to have your pieces overcut, and then you can cut them to the real deal. There's 3 7/8, and there's 3 7/8. And here's 3 7/8. Whoop. Alrighty, let's do the same thing. Well, yeah, we might as well go ahead and square this up. I didn't the first one, but it fit so perfectly. I think we're okay. And this has got a selvage. So this time we have to square up the bottom too and get the selvage off. You never want to sew a selvage into a quilt block. It just well, you know, those of you who are longtime quilters know this, but if you're new to quilting, the selvage is a very tightly woven piece of cloth that goes along the straight of grain edge of the fabric. And it's there to help hold the fabric on machines when it's being rolled. And it shrinks different, it sews different, lays different. And it's a good idea to not put a selvage edge into your quilt. Okay, there's my background blocks all cut out. Okay, so I've got everything cut out. These are going to be on the outside of my block, and that's the outside of my block. Well, these might be my little diamonds. This is the center. I thought I'd choose a lighter fabric for the center so that if I want to do some embroidery on here, I can. And these are my backgrounds. So the next thing we need to do, we should have 2 center block pieces. Everything is 3 7/8 inch square. So we should have 2 center block pieces and 6 background pieces. And now what we're going to do is on the back of all 6 of these and both of these is we're going to take a ruler and we're going to draw a diagonal line from point to point. And it's not going to matter which one, we just need a diagonal line. So we'll be real careful about that. And we'll draw a nice diagonal line on each of these blocks on the back side. And I'm just using a friction pen. You could probably get away with using about anything because it's on the back. And we're going to cut on it. So it'll be mostly cut away anyway. So we'll go ahead and we'll mark all these blocks and move on to the next step. So you can see in the picture that's with this video that our block has sort of got windmill blades kind of going around the central part of the block. And our directions tell us that we want to take our 2 center block pieces, which are 3 7/8. Everything is 3 7/8 because we're making half square triangles. So we want to take these 2 pieces of fabric are going to be my windmill blades, and this is my center part of my block. So that's the only thing you have to really worry about when you're starting to put these triangles and squares together to make your triangles, is to put the 2 center 3 7/8 squares over 2 of the squares that you want to be your windmill blades. Everything else, we're just going to stack them up and sew them right down the middle, 1/4 of an inch on each side of the line we drew. And we'll just match everything up and we'll sew right down these lines all at once over at the machine. We can do our piecing that way. Do it all at the same time. We did a little bit of that on block 1. So this is a block that's going to teach you all about half square triangles, because every single part of this block is a half square triangle. And I've put in the notes how to make any square a half square triangle so that you can make smaller or larger ones. If you want to reduce this block down, you can. If you want to make it bigger, you can. You just add 3/8 inch to the size of the block on your pattern, and you'll be able to make half square triangles. Okay, I'll finish pinning these and meet you over at the sewing machine. Okay, so we're at the machine, and I wanted to show you again. I do realize that the 37D foot, which I love, is actually designed for the 5mm throat plate machines, and that I have the 770 and mine is 9mm. But there is enough teeth. It does work. And I love the 37D foot because it's exactly a 1/4 inch on each side. And you'll see how handy that comes in when you're doing your chain piecing. But something that we talked about for block 1, and we're going to kind of review it here. I always keep this little ruler here at my machine. I use it for a lot of things, but mostly I use it to check seam allowances. And so on here I've got my foot down and my needle down. So I'm going to check my 1/4 inch seam allowance here. So I'm going to hold the camera so that I hope you can see that I'm holding the ruler up against the needle, right even with it and up against it. So I'm including the needle in this 1/4 inch measurement, which I don't know, the needle might be a millimeter. I don't know what it is. I just know that when I'm even with the needle and I look over to the edge of my presser foot, it's exactly a 1/4 inch, including the needle, the width of the needle. So that's kind of my version of the scant 1/4 inch. So I hope that helps you to make sure that your blocks are going to come out correctly. If you cut them just right, I'm going to move you over a little more, and you measure your seam allowance over to the edge, including the needle. I'm trying to do this so you can see exactly how I do it, but there it is. If I don't breathe, but there it is, including my needle. It's a 1/4 inch, and that's my version of the scant 1/4 inch. The width of the needle sort of allows for the fold that's going to be on your patchwork when you press your seams. So hopefully that helps you get just right. And you know, these little notches are also 1/4 inch measurements. There's one at the back, one right at the needle, and one here. So if you needed to turn a corner or something at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you could. That's just a little extra there. Okay, so now let me zoom you back out, and we'll do a little patchwork here. And we're going to chain piece these guys. So I have to raise my needle because you have to start on the fabric. Let's see, I might as well raise my presser foot too and get the stitch up out of here. So there's a stitch down in there now. So I'm going to pull that up out of there. And I've got Ava's, I'm still working with my little patches of flannel for Ava's little blanket to use. I'm using this as a leader. And so, whoops, you know what? I forgot to put my dual feed foot down. We won't get very far without that. If you have a D foot on and you forget to put your dual feed down, you'll know pretty quick that it's not going to work because your fabric isn't going to get pulled through there very good. And you'll know. So I have a 7511 needle in here. It's an organ needle. I'm using 2.5 stitch length. And I think I have my single millimeter hole on there. So I'm getting ready to head through with my first piece of patchwork, and I'm going to go right down this side of the line. If you do use your single hole or your embroidery stitch plate, it's very helpful. Your fabric just glides along and the feed dogs don't touch so much. So now look what I can do with my 37D foot. I can come in on the other side since it's exactly a 1/4 inch also. And I know the quilt teachers out there are cringing. saying, please don't tell him to use the 37D foot. But I can't help it. I really like it. It works great. And you can give it a try. Okay, now which side? This side. Takes a little mental processing, but it certainly is handy. Okay, gotta take my pen out. So just a reminder, press till your fabric is starched really, really well. Cut completely accurately. Measure twice, cut once. Make sure, absolutely sure, that your seam allowance is a scant 1/4 inch. And don't hurry. There's no need to rush. And just take your time and stitch all your pieces. And when we get down to the end of this, we're going to turn around and come back and stitch on the other side. Okay, we got all of our squares together. Now we're going to cut them apart on the line that we drew, not the stitching. You'll cry a lot if you cut them apart on the stitching. So we'll cut them all apart just like this on the line that we drew. And then we'll be ready to start laying out our block. And that is going to be fun because we're going to have to figure out how we want to press these seams. There's an awful lot of seams that have to fit together in this block. So we'll have to figure it out and think about it, which is part of the joy of quilting. You know, most quilters were born to be engineers, and that's kind of what we do when we do quilting. We figure out lots of measurements, angles, curves, everything. Okay, I'll finish cutting these apart and line them up, and then we'll be back. Okay, so here's my block. I've cut my patchwork, my chain piecing apart, and I have not pressed anything. I have just put the seams sort of the way I think they might go and put a long pin to kind of hold it in place, and then just laid out my pieces. And already I see that I'm going to have to be pressing something differently because these are just not going to work. There's going to be so much heavy, a bulky place there. So let's start with the 4 corners and head them the other direction. The general rule of thumb for quilting is to always press toward the dark, but now we have one going up and one going down, so they'll actually hug each other right there. See that? And we should have a really nice little seam when we're done. And after we get this all figured out, how we're going to press this, we're going to square up all these little squares. Then we'll square up quadrants. We'll make sure we're still even. Then we'll put the block together. So let me work on this a little more. I guess we've already decided that we're going to press these toward the background, these 4 corners. I'm just very gently finger pressing that because I don't really want to go to it with the heat from the iron until I'm done making sure this is how, because I got you know, I've got some rows that have to go together too, and it would be nice if those seams would nest also. So the one thing we know for sure is that all 4 outside corners have to be pressed toward the background. So we've got that much figured out. So what do we have here? So we can't move that one. Same deal down here at this corner. What happens? Maybe we'll have to press them all open. What happens if we do that one? Nope, won't work. So that has to stay the same. This block has to stay the same. Okay, we're opposite down here too, aren't we? Okay, so all 4 outside borders are okay just by turning the 4 corners. So let's kind of pull these, explode these back a little bit. So we've got that all figured out. Now we have to figure out this interior. And so, what do we got here? Same deal. So let's put this one. Okay, 2, it looks like. 2 of our interior, these 2 opposite corners of each other, will have to be pressed toward the light and not the dark. And I think that's it. Yep. Okay, that's got it. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to measure all these little blocks and square them up. Well, I'm going to press them now that I know which way I want the seams to go. And you could press all these open. If it's too much for you, just press them open and it'll be just fine. So then I'm going to press them, and then I'm going to do some measuring and make sure I'm still on track for the right size for these little guys. And then we'll start assembling the block. Okay, so I totally screwed up on the pressing. So what I ended up doing, I kept checking things as I was going along, you know, which direction I was pressing the seams, because I wanted everything to hug. So what I ended up doing was just pressing each piece, checking as I went along, pressing each piece so that it did hug, and got them all to where I think they're going to be okay. But big suggestion here for you, if you don't want to have to go through what I just did, just press all your seams open. So the next step is to, I'm going to scooch all my pieces over a little bit so you can see. The next step is to trim these little half square triangles to size. So on your ruler, you're going to have I hope you have a ruler that will fit, that will work. If you don't, they're not very expensive, and I just use Omnigrid rulers. But there are some really pretty ones out there that you can get. But here we have this diagonal line, and we have the 1 through 5 goes this way, and the 1 through 5 goes this way, inches. So these little blocks, just these half square triangle blocks here, they need to be exactly 3.5 inches. So we want to run that diagonal line right down the seam, and we can take off the dog ear, the little puppy dog ear, and I can see that I'm 1/8 of an inch off here. So I'm going to turn my little block and I'm going to put it on the exact 3.5 inch markings. And when I do that, my diagonal line should go right down because I lined it up with one side. So now I'm going to trim this to exactly 3.5 inches. Got to come around you. So now, there we go. So let's check it. Oh, that's nice. Very nice. It's perfect. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to trim every last one of these half square triangles to 3.5 inches. Okay, here's my block, all trimmed up. Everything looks pretty good. There were a couple of little quadrants that, half square triangles that just weren't quite 3.5 inches. So I'm going to be mindful of when I put these rows together and do my flipping and nesting of seams to make sure things are lining up just the way I want them to. So now the trick is to flip and flip, and we'll sew these two together this way, and we'll make sure that our seams nest. If I got my little half square triangles mixed up when I was pressing and cutting, then I'll swap them out with the one that's the right one. But this looks good. And this one looks right. So I'll start piecing things together with a 1/4 inch seam, being really careful. And when I turn these right side out and press them, then I will sew this center seam and I'll have a row. And then I'll sew this row, and this row. Then we'll connect rows, and then we'll connect the block down the center. I've got my rows all together now. And now it's time to think a little bit more. If you haven't pressed your seams open, it's time to think a little bit more about what direction to press these seams, because we want these to nest up. So best suggestion that I've got is to do kind of like we did before. See what direction you want your seam to go and use a pin. And that way when you get to the ironing board, everything will be going the right direction. And you can get things pressed the right way. And I would just go with what direction seems to be the most logical on some of these. This one's not, this is going to be a lot of bulk on the outer edge. So let's see about if we can get away with pressing this one this direction. That lets this piece here lay flat. So we'll get a much better look to the block when we're done. And so I'll just go along and try to determine what way I want to press each row. And then, like I said before, I'm going to join the rows, then join the block. Just a quick reminder here that when you're joining these rows, and you're stitching along and you're coming to these points, when you get here, have your needle pierce the fabric and stitch just to the right of the X. There's kind of a little X here, and you're going to want to have your needle come in just to the right of that, and the same down here, you're going to want to stay. And if you want to, you can even you can stop sewing, break your thread, turn it over, come back on this side where you can see better, and stay to the right within the seam allowance of these points, so that when you when you press, when you get your rows together and you've pressed, these points are lining up really pretty. So that's kind of just the trick to it, is to just stay one little needle width in the seam allowance when you're coming past these points. Alrighty, last seam. So right down the middle, and you can see some of these seams come together with quite a few points, you know, that have to kind of line up here. So you want to be real careful about your pressing, that you're real accurate with that. You don't want to press your block parts out of shape or anything like that. Just make sure and be really careful when you're sewing along, and press carefully, and you'll get along just fine with all those points, all these seams coming together. So, okay, this is my last put it together seam, and we'll be back and our block will be finished. Alrighty, moment of truth. This block should be 12.5 inches, and this is a 12.5 inch ruler. Okay, so down here along this side, kind of more toward this corner, I am off about a 1/16 of an inch, and the same up here from about here to here. So here's what I'm going to do. And this is a little trick that quilters often use. And to teach you about it, I have to go back to some different kinds of needlework, like crocheting and knitting and tatting. When, especially when cotton is involved, you can actually wet something and sort of coax it into the size that you want, and that's what's called blocking. And you can actually block a quilt block. So when you crochet or knit something, it has to be blocked before it can be dry cleaned or washed the first time, so that it keeps its shape. And you can do the same thing with cotton fabric. And so what I'm going to do is moisten this. I'll use my little spray bottle and I'll moisten it all over, and I'll take my ruler to the ironing board with me, and I will pin it along all four sides to measure exactly 12.5 inches, because I'm only off a tiny bit. So I think I just need just a little here and a little down here blocking, and then I will press it dry, and it will be exactly 12.5 inches. So that is block number 2 for February. Not very Valentine's-y, but you can make yours a Valentine block. And so I hope you've enjoyed sewing this up. Make sure that you don't use steam in your iron. Cut carefully, stitch your 1/4 inch carefully, and watch your pressing on your seams, you know, how you want them to nest if you don't press them open. Mine, I just was careful as I went along, and they all worked out just great. So, but that could be why, actually, that I'm a 1/16 of an inch difference from these 2 diagonal corners too, is that, you know, maybe maybe I didn't nest as good as I could have. But I think all my points look pretty good on this block. And so it's going to set in the quilt like this on the diagonal. And I might go ahead and find something to embroider here in the center. Even though it has some seams here, that's not going to bother me one bit to do some embroidery in here. Oftentimes on the group, people will ask, well, can I embroider over seams? Yes, you can, very easily, with the correct stabilizer, the correct needle, and the correct thread. You can do just about anything in embroidery. So there is our February block. I may look for something to put in the middle here. I'll see. Hope you have fun with it. And I will see you the 1st of March on video for block number 3.